Well, happy Super Bowl Sunday once again, friends. Later today, we'll have millions of people gathering around their televisions and various screens to watch a joyous event. Hours of nonsensical commercials, polarizing halftime musical acts, and endless calories of the unhealthiest, yet the most delicious foods one can imagine. And oh yeah, there'll be two football teams competing for the most coveted of victories and titles as Super Bowl champions. In all seriousness, the Super Bowl is a wonderful event because of all these things coming together in one shared experience. But one of the things that draws people to this particular sport of football is the beauty of the game itself. To the common eye, most professional football looks like a bunch of extremely large men violently crashing into one another with each and every play. And yes, while that is perhaps true, there are all sorts of wonderful things about the game as well that are not quite as apparent. For instance, I love the athleticism of these players that they display with each and every play. From the smallest of the kickers to the largest of the linemen, these are some of the most strongest, they're some of the most talented, fastest men on the planet, making incredible throws, catches, and maneuvers with each and every step. I love the team mindset of football. Sure, there are all sorts of individual accomplishments on the field, but each player ultimately celebrates a team-first mentality when playing the game, relying on their teammates to join them in their efforts. And I love the strategy of football. Many have observed the correlation between the game of football and military strategy. Team playbooks may look similar to battle plans. Hours upon hours of research, practice, and study go into each and every second of the game. Coaches and players brainstorm ways to capitalize upon the weaknesses and vulnerabilities of their opponents as they seek ultimate victory on the field. Yes, there is a lot attached to winning the Super Bowl each year. The victorious team will forever be remembered in the history books as gods amongst men. Many individual career accolades are attached to Super Bowl victories. And upon return to the home city or their town, the victorious players and coaches are treated as conquering heroes. The town's own self-esteem and their very identity bolstered by the team's victory. And with each Super Bowl victory, there's also defeat on the opposite side. Many players and coaches say that they remember the losses more than the victories when reflecting on their careers. After all, it is so hard to get to such an opportunity as this Super Bowl in the first place. There is no guarantee of ever returning. Just ask Dan Marino of the Miami Dolphins. Or better yet, try being a fan of my Cleveland Browns. Yes, the Super Bowl is just one game, yet it carries with it implications that go well beyond this one event. I wonder how many of us go through particular life events that seem to have consequences that exceed that momentary experience. How many of us have experienced victories or successes that we still remember with pride to this day? How many of us have experienced hardships or losses in life that continue to affect us each and every day? This morning, I'm not here to only talk about football. We can do so during the fellowship hour. This morning, I'd like for us to reflect on our life experiences and how we either have the ability to allow them to control the rest of our lives moving forward, or how we also have the opportunity to allow God to transform these life experiences into something truly sacred for God's kingdom purposes. We continue with Paul's second letter to the Corinthians once again as he reflects on his own life experiences and how within his conversion and life of ministry he has come to experience the liberating love of Christ. And so let's get back to this wonderful text once again. We're reading once again in chapter 12, beginning with verse 1, which is part of what is called Paul's fool's speech, which again begins with the previous chapter. As he writes to the Corinthians, according to these biblical scholars, they entitled this section here. Within our own reading, we can sense that Paul is at odds within himself. He writes that boasting about oneself is foolishness on one hand, and yet he feels obligated to justify his ministry with these Corinthians and to address any of these accusations from his opponents. Here in the opening verses of this chapter, Paul even reveals that he has had his own direct sacred encounter with the holy. As he writes, he knows a guy, this guy being Paul himself, who had experienced the highest level of heaven. But even this experience, Paul writes, is not what gives him credibility to share the good news of the risen Christ. No, it is about about his accomplishments and accolades, but rather his struggles. Verse 5 reads, "On behalf of such a one I will boast, but on my own behalf I will not boast, except of my weaknesses," Paul writes. And then in verse 7, Paul quickly moves to allude to this other extreme of life's experiences, now describing not only those successes in life, but those very weaknesses and struggles that have plagued him, we find out, for ages. Again, verse 7, "Therefore, to keep me from being too elated, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me, to keep me from being too elated." Now, what this thorn is exactly, according to the biblical scholars, we don't quite know. But scholars have surmised that it could be anything from perhaps a chronic physical ailment to even a mental disorder of some sort. We know that Paul has lived with it for some time. And here, also pay attention. We have Paul once again applying his lived experience, his personal highs and lows, to his theological proclamations about the nature of God. And again, we pick up with verse 8. 3 times, Paul says, "I appealed to the Lord about this, that it would leave me, but God said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness.'" Paul continues, "So I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. And therefore I am content with weaknesses and insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities, all for Christ's sake. For whenever I am weak, then I am strong." That line again. "My grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness." We're attracted to the beauty of this one particular message, but what can it mean for us today as followers of Jesus? We have here a wonderful message of dichotomy for Paul, capturing the paradoxical nature of God and God's kingdom. In boasting and in humility, in celebrations and in hardships, in strengths and weaknesses, in successes and failures, God's grace is revealed. The term grace can be understood in a variety of ways these days. According to the Westminster Dictionary of Theological Terms, grace is defined as unmerited favor from God. But keep in mind, that's just the first of 22 additional sub-definitions of that term grace. For Paul, it is important to acknowledge that while, yes, he did experience the divine within his own heavenly revelation, as he alludes to in the opening verses of this chapter, God was also revealed in Paul's very human, broken experiences of life on this earth, including the pain and hardships that he continued to experience in his life, that thorn he alludes to. In fact, perhaps Paul might posit, God's saving grace is most readily present in those moments of weakness and suffering. Christ's suffering on the cross being the epitome of such an experience. Friends, our good news today is that true liberation and salvation is found not only within our superhuman accomplishments or successes, but in the everyday moments of life on this earth, victories and failures alike, where God's grace can be genuinely experienced. And that grace is sufficient. I know I need to hear such good news in my life today. Perhaps you do as well. Because if there is anything we should be taking away from our reading today, it is a reminder that God uses all of our lives, both good and bad, to point not to our own accomplishments or experiences, but to the transforming work of the Spirit moving amongst us today. And that grace, well, it is sufficient. It is enough. We don't all need to be superhero athletes. After all, we're all just doing the best we know how in this world. To the caregiver seeking some sense of peace and calm in their life, God's grace is sufficient for you. To the mother raising kids on her own, God's grace is sufficient for you. To the retired couple trying to make financial ends meet with rising medical costs, God's grace is sufficient for you. To the members and friends of First Presbyterian Church who are seeking clarity of vision and direction for this church moving forward, God's grace is sufficient for you. We as children of God are invited to bring our whole selves to our loving parent, whether we win or whether we lose. And by God's sufficient grace, our lives, all that we are, flaws and all, are transformed for the purposes of God's kingdom, to God's glory. Friends, if you have a chance, if you are still awake by the end of the game tonight, there will most likely be a group of players and coaches from both teams gathering on the football field. And after all the blood, sweat, and tears that are left out on the field after that football game, they will gather to pray together and to give thanks to God who makes all things possible. What a beautiful reminder for us today. No matter where we find ourselves within our lives, whether it's in life's triumphs or failures, may we be reminded of God's life-saving, sufficient grace moving within our lives today, transforming us into Christ's hands and feet right here in Staunton, Virginia. Agents of God's love and grace for a world in need of good news. To God be the glory. Alleluia. Amen.